next athlete was a transformative figure who broke down barriers as a humanitarian and was also one of the most talented athletes in the history of the game. Number 28 is Arthur Ashe.
Difficult guy to play because he had a big serve and teed off on his ground strokes, and you couldn't get in a groove with Arthur.
Ashe honed his game early on while attending UCLA and helped the team win a national championship in 1965. Just a few years later, he would win the U.S. National Amateur Championship, qualifying him for the first ever Open U.S. Championships.
Nobody expected much of him because the field was loaded with pros, Rod Laver, Kenny Rosewell, Pancho Gonzalez. But there was Arthur Ashe winning the U.S. Open.
With his win, Arthur became the first black male to win any major. A natural leader, Ashe became a figurehead with the ATP, supporting the boycott of Wimbledon in 1973. Later, he would be a surprise finalist at the All-England Club in 1975.
His favorite victory was beating Jimmy Connors, thought to be invincible at that time.
Arthur Ashe was underdog here with the Wimbledon bookies 16-1. He was also the president of the ATP Tennis Association. Connors was suing Arthur personally, the Players Association, Jack Kramer, and myself. So when they went out to play, of course, the press wrote a ton of things about all the problems the previous year or two with the Wimbledon boycott, and now Connors is suing the head of the ATP, which was Arthur Ashe.
Arthur had a winning game plan, slowing it down.
That's it, and he's done it.
There he was, the champion of Wimbledon, something that most people said would be way beyond his reach.
The win would be Arthur's third and final major. However, it wouldn't be his last victory. Arthur fought alongside fellow players like Cliff Drysdale to end apartheid in South Africa, as well as push forth efforts and programs to educate kids and end hunger.
He did more for tennis, but also after his tennis, he did a lot as a humanitarian with apartheid in South Africa, with hunger. He was into a lot of things.
He felt like he had an obligation to make the world a better place. You know, the whole thing with South Africa and apartheid. Arthur was a terrific, terrific human being.
And to talk more about Arthur Ashe, Paul and I welcome in Richard Evans from Tennis.com, longtime journalist. Richard, I know you've spent time with Arthur. You have written about Arthur. You took 2 trips to Africa with Arthur Ashe. What was that like?
That was amazing. It was groundbreaking. Of course, Owen Williams, who lives up the road here in Palm Beach, was the instigator of going to the Prime Minister of South Africa and persuading him to allow Arthur into the country. It was just fascinating how Arthur was able to handle the whole situation. He was invited to go to a meeting of black journalists, and they gave him a terribly hard time because a lot of people felt that he was just playing into the hands of the Afrikaner government by being there. It was in a small hall packed to the rafters, and somebody shouted out, "Uncle Tom." And here was this tennis player having to deal with it. But Arthur had been well trained in how to handle the transition from being a black sportsman into a white world by his mentor in Lynchburg and Dr. Johnson, and he handled it brilliantly. But the whole trip was just fascinating back then in 1973, such a different era, and it was apartheid, and Arthur went away with his thoughts. He'd agreed not to criticize the government while he was in the country, but of course he had plenty to say when he left.
Hey, Richard, it's good to see you happy and healthy, my friend. Thanks for coming on. I wanted to ask you, as a 12-year-old, I got to sit back and watch Arthur play Jimmy Connors in that final at Wimbledon. And I remember sitting back and watching kind of this graceful, humble guy go out and be so thoughtful and try to find a way and execute a way, which he did, in carving up Jimmy Connors. Tell me a little bit about Arthur's aura in the locker room back in those days.
Well, Arthur's win was, for me, at Wimbledon in 1975, beating Jimmy Connors, was the greatest intellectual victory and the most astounding sporting performance in many ways that I've ever seen. And you're the perfect foil for this, Paul, because I'm going to try and switch it to you and say, okay, this is going to be the most important match of your life. Wimbledon, center stage, you know you've only got this one chance. You're playing a guy who the locker room was saying is unbeatable, and you're going to have to do it, Paul Annacone, by staying on the baseline. Those of us who know how you played know that you never let the ball bounce. You were at the net all the time. Okay, now that's what Arthur had to do, because Arthur knew that if he gave Jimmy Connors pace, then he'd get killed. Connors fed off his opponent's pace. He was a small man. He couldn't generate it himself. So the night before, Donald Dell and Charlie Passerelle and Arthur Ashe went to the Playboy Club in Park Lane and worked out a strategy. And the strategy was dink, push, take the pace off the ball, lob, and Connors fell apart because he had nothing to work with. But that was totally contrary to the way that Arthur played his tennis. Completely. He was a big smash, crash, serve and volley, hit it as hard as you can guy. And suddenly he was having to push and dink and lob, and it was brilliant. It was absolutely astounding.
Oh, those are just fantastic stories, Richard. It is great to have you here on Tennis Channel Live. You can read more of Richard's stories about Arthur in his book, The Roving Eye, and on tennis.com as well. Stay safe, stay healthy, Richard, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.